Okay, first of all, section 5 people. I need people for Thursday to be pulling the MU2 engines off. So if I need probably 6 people.
Dara, do you want us to email you?
Yeah. Well, no, I don't. Yeah, I guess that's the best way to get a hold of me, or just show up. I got a class at 1 o'clock, so if you were able to show up like somewhere between 1 and like around 1, that would be great. So whoever shows up can get on it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can everybody see what I've got up there?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
beautiful. Thank
Yep.
you. Okay, so you can see right there, it's talking about systems here. I'm going to start right here with the system checks and what what you're looking for, and then we'll get into the power plant limits and a couple of other things here first. But so like we all know, we have to do our external and internal safety inspection, and then when we're doing our flows, we'll check certain things. So the first bit there is the hydraulics. So you can see the quantity is important. So we want to make, in our 727, it's about 4 gallons. We want to make sure that we have that, and we want to make sure that the pumps work and the pressure checks. Remember this number: hydraulics is 3,000 plus or minus 200 psi. That's pretty well standard across the board. Some airplanes have higher, like not some, I shouldn't say, like the 787, its hydraulics are up around 5,000 psi, depending on what's providing it. But at the end of the day, that's a different bird altogether with the way they do things. So the vast majority of airplanes, the hydraulic pressures are around 3,000 plus or minus 200. So that means unloaded with no hydraulics operating, that's what you should see. Anything within that range. So 2,800 to 3,200 psi is considered normal. Remember, hydraulic pumps, you're not allowed to adjust them. But having said that, if you were in the middle of lower Slobovia, you might want, when you get a pump that's 3,300, there is an adjustment on it that you can do, but generally it's not approved to do it. But again, like I said, in the real world, when you're stuck in some place and that's the only pump you have, you may want to consider doing something along those lines. But if anybody asks me, I'm never going to tell them I said you could do that. But at the end of the day, it's realistic. So keep that in mind. And also, again, I've said this before, the brake pressure and reset the brakes again. So whenever you're checking hydraulics, you think brakes, and whenever you're thinking brakes, you think hydraulics. So those two are hand in hand. And every time you do that, when we're sitting there, it's acceptable to reset the brakes. So literally, when you go out and do your external safety inspection, come in and do your internal safety inspection, and then you power the airplane, one of the first things you're going to do is reset the brakes. And then when you do a flow, you're going to look at the brakes. And the guy in the left seat will do his flow and he'll check his brake pressure because he has the parking brake lever on his side. He'll check it, and then he'll check hydraulics again and reset the brakes. And then you go out and do your walk around, and you come back in, check your circuit breakers, sit in your seat. One of the first things you're going to look at is hydraulic quantities and pressures. and your brake pressure and reset the parking brake. What I'm getting at is it's very prudent to ensure that you have braking all the time. Again, this comes down to, do you trust the person that's handling the hydraulic system? And again, it comes down to your responsibility. Even though this person's back there and they may forget to do something, it's up to you to catch it. So even though they did their flow, and as an example, in our 727 on the FE panel, when you look at the hydraulics, you want to make sure that the pumps are on. People have been caught with accumulators, because the accumulator will give you maybe 15, if you're lucky, brake applications. So when you're taxiing the airplane from point A to point B, you might eat up those brake applications. So like I explained to most of you, when you're taxiing a large airplane, at least one with power plants mounted to the fuselage, it's pretty acceptable to run one in reverse so that you're not on the brakes all the time. But accumulators can get you in trouble. So that's why we have standard operating procedures. That's why you do things like the way I'm explaining it, so that you don't get caught with your pants down when you're trying to stop the airplane to prevent it from driving into a building. So the hydraulics are important. Then the electrics. You can see it's pretty straightforward. I described the electrical panels on the APU and the engines to you. So the three engines, what you normally should see when you sit down at that seat is the bus tie breakers are closed, so the light will be extinguished. The generator breakers will be open, so those lights should be illuminated, and the field relay or field breakers should be extinguished. They should be normally closed. So if the BTB or the field breaker lights are illuminated, you can simply at that time close them. And they will close. The engines don't have to be running or anything. They're just simply relays. That's why I said bus tie relay or bus tie breaker. They're the same thing. So that's normal when you're looking at the electrics. And the switches that I'm talking about are straightforward, like lighting. We don't want landing lights on. We don't want our anti-collision light on. We want our nav lights on. So in your flow, you're looking for things that are normal. And we're not going to the full extent of checking every light on the airplane when we get in, which you would normally do if you were flying it, but pertinent systems, when you're taxiing it, you should. So those lights, when you press to test them, if it's illuminated on our airplane, it usually flashes, so it'll go out and then re-illuminate. That is a normal test. And if it's extinguished, it should illuminate. That's not only testing the light bulb. In most cases, it's testing the light bulb and the wiring right to whatever you're looking at, either a low pressure switch or something like that. So I don't know if you've noticed, I didn't really talk much about it, just a little bit. But on the front panel on the 727, there's 3 amber lights that indicate the low oil pressure. So when we get in the airplane and power it up, you'll see that these things are brightly illuminated. And then when we start the engines, they go out. There are low oil pressure annunciator lights for the front end crew, the guys sitting looking forward most cases. The engineer panel has low pressure indicator, so he should see it there if it's real. If it's not real, one of those two is going to be telling you that the pressure is good. So, that's another problem. But at the end of the day, those lights forward, when we push it, it should extinguish and then re-illuminate. And that's testing the pressure transmitter and everything. So also on the FE panel is really important, obviously. We want to make sure the packs are off. So those switches should be in the off position. The bleed switches should be in the off position. The boost pumps should be off position. The hydraulic pumps should be in the off position when you initially do your flow. So when you get into the seat, what I'm hoping to see is that you start basically at the AC selector switch and go up and to the battery panel and then down through the electrical panel, then to the right. This is the 727 flow, then to the right and to the middle and back up. There's not much there to look at other than the start valve open lights. And at the top right, we get into the pneumatic panel. The bleed should be off. The pack should be off. And then we come down to the hydraulic panel. And everything should be off. So that's B pumps, ground interconnect, and the A pump switches should all be off. And then you get to the fuel panel and you set the boost pumps to off. Make sure that the crossfeed valves are in the open position because all of our fuel is in number 2 tank. Then you get into the radio panel or the audio select panel. FE panel is not a big deal, but the two in the front, we should make sure that we have the VHF number 1 and number 2 selected correctly. The other day, I couldn't figure out why the hell I wasn't getting ATIS. I even asked the controller before I think it was Mr. Hannes actually noticed that the frequency was off on the number 2 side. So somebody was in the airplane playing airplane, and they switched the radios. So anyway, it was a nice pickup, Mr. Hannes. I appreciated that. Are you there, Mr. Hannes?
I am.
Good job. Thank you. So pretty straightforward, right? And you can see the fuel pumps on and working. I do that. This is your flow, and I just said to make sure they're off. But just before when I'm saying okay, we're going to start engines, then you should go and do another flow and make sure that the boost pumps are on, and then go around to your bleeds and make sure the bleeds are on, so that there's pneumatic air. Obviously, we'll have the AP running at this time. With the fuel system, there's more than that. There's quantity, so we have enough to do our engine run, our taxi, weight and balance. It is important on an airplane like our 727 because all of the weight, obviously, with the engines are about 6,000 pounds a piece. So there's 18,000 pounds back there trying to put this airplane on its back. So, on its butt anyway. So what we want to do is make sure there's enough fuel in the airplane that we don't have that issue. The 727 minimum taxi fuel to be safe is about 23,000 pounds if you have fuel in every tank. If you don't have that amount of fuel, then you're going to move it into the number 2 tank and at least have it as forward as possible. Because what could happen is if you have too much aft C of G here as we taxi, the nose wheel could be extended so far that you start contacting the centering cam. And that's, that's standard for any airplane that's sitting here with tail-mounted engines. You have to be concerned about that if you don't have enough gas or it's not in the right spot for taxi. Everybody knows what the centering cam. Does anyone not know what a centering cam is? Okay, good. Oh, say again, Nisha?
Yeah, could you explain that?
Yeah, okay. Centering cam is like when the aircraft takes off and the nose gear extends or the nose oleo extends. This cam, so if for whatever reason the nose wheel is off center, so that before it goes in the wheel well, this cam literally centers it. It's like on the oleo itself as it extends, there's a cam connected to it, and there's a receiver cam that's connected to the cylinder internally. So when that oleo extends, these two cams mate, and it'll center the oleo, and then the nose gear will be able to go into the wheel well. I don't know if you saw an A320 that landed with the nose gear completely sideways. Did you guys see that anywhere on a YouTube? Yeah, like what they had there was they had some sort of issue with this centering cam. So when they extended the gear, the nose gear or their steering scissors or something went wrong, and this cam probably didn't make. So the gear, when it came out and it extended, it allowed the gear to just swivel around or whatever. Maybe it was because of the steering cylinders or not. I'm not sure, but that was strange that gear came out like it was. So these centering cams, as the gear is extended, you're not on the ground, you're flying, they should keep the nose gear completely straight until you land and this oleo compresses, everything should be fine. So if we don't have the fuel where we want it in our 727, you could end up getting, once you get into that centering cam, then your steering doesn't work and there's all kinds of nasty things. So my point, the fuel has to be there for those reasons. Enough for the run. So taxiing, doing a power assurance test, weight and balance, and another good one is hydraulic cooling. So we all know that the coldest tank on most aircraft will have a hydraulic cooling line through it. Works really well. It's just it's just laid in the fuel cell, and it will depend on on a larger airplane that has multiple hydraulic systems. There may be every fuel tank might have a cooling plumbing in it. So keep that in mind when I'm asking you what you're checking for with the electrics. You want to make sure that switches are normal, meaning what I explained to you. Okay, the fuel. You're not just checking for the pumps that are on and working. You're also checking for the quantity for those reasons. Okay, and then we get to the pneumatics. The bleeds should be on, so that we have duct pressure, and the packs are off, depending on what you're going to do. But as you go, but for engine start, packs will always be off. It doesn't matter what the airplane is. You will shut the packs off for the engine start. Okay. And then we get down when running the engine to check the anti-ice. You need to check the fuel and air engine anti-ice. So if you're checking anti-ice on the engine, remember there's fuel heat and there's engine inlet anti-icing. All right. So make sure you understand you're going to check both of them. And remember, if I put the engine anti-ice, what indications do I see? Anyone, please?
Isn't it low EPR or something?
No, EPR's got nothing to do with my fuel heat. Well, I shouldn't say that. You'll see something in EPR if we're at a cruise power setting, that's for sure. You'll see it actually roll back and roll up. But that's kind of a secondary thing. What's the most important thing that I've tried to get through to people, that when you put fuel heat on, what other system's going to tell us that it's working?
Oil.
Oil, beautiful. And what's it going to do?
Cool, hopefully.
No.
No. Okay.
What it is the oil system, but what indication am I looking for when I put fuel heat on?
Isn't your oil temp going to go down a little bit?
Why would it go down?
Well,
you're on the right track.
You're using the oil to heat the fuel, so as a result, the oil itself is going to get a little colder.
No, I'm not using the oil to heat the fuel. If I have a fuel heater, it's not oil. What is it?
It's going up.
And why? What heats the fuel?
Air.
Bleed air?
Air, bleed air, exactly. So if I heat the fuel with bleed air, this fuel-cooled oil cooler that you guys keep misunderstanding, that's a fuel heater, it is not a fuel heater. It is a fuel-cooled oil cooler. So it is happening all the time. As soon as I heat the fuel, now the fuel is getting much hotter. So the oil that's cooling it is going to get hotter. So you'll see that. I've seen that. I saw that in exams. I saw that. I'm hearing it now. You guys, I'm not saying that fuel-cooled oil coolers don't heat the oil, but when it's a fuel heater, it's going to use bleed air. And the fuel-cooled oil cooler, some engines, some small engines and older engines will just use that kind of method. And if you look, we'll just use the fuel-cooled oil cooler. And it makes sense. If you look at the diagram again of the fuel system, the fuel-cooled oil cooler is downstream of the fuel flow transmitter. No, actually it's, it is downstream of the fuel flow transmitter just before the flow divider. So it's way down there. that fuel that you're thinking the oil's going to heat is just going to the fuel flow transmit or to the flow divider. So just the architecture of that should help you. So try to keep remembering that, please, okay? Because that's going to come up at you out in the world. So, and you can see there the icing conditions. You're going to need to memorize that. I've talked a little bit about it over the year, but that's a memory item that you need to remember. +10 to -40 degrees Celsius with visible moisture present within 1 nautical mile. That is something you need to memorize for the rest of your career. So when you get into an airplane and those conditions exist, as soon as you start the engines, it is prudent and required to put on the engine anti-ice. So when you do you got to consider that when you're doing a power assurance test. It's like, okay, I got engine anti-ice on. You want to make sure that that's taken into account because that changes your parameters and things like that. It usually doesn't affect the power output of the airplane when the aircrew are flying it. Usually it does not. When you put engine anti-ice on, that's taken into account with the performance of the airplane. But for maintenance people with your maintenance runs, it may affect your parameters. So it depends on the aircraft. So keep that in mind, please. +10 to -40 degrees Celsius with visible moisture within 1 nautical mile. So it's quite a range. But even if it's -30 and there's ice fog out there, you're going to get a good chance that these engines will produce on the inlet icing. And it's the type of icing you get is like it's a rime type icing. It looks like the ice that forms in your freezer. This stuff breaks off very easily. So what you don't want to do is start the engine, taxi the airplane with the anti-ice off, because there's a good chance that you're going to build this ice, and it'll build very quickly and very much in these conditions if they're they're ripe for it. If it's like +5 degrees and there's a lot of moisture out there, rain or whatever, you could build up quite a bit of ice on the inlet cowling, and then it breaks off and boom, it does some damage to the engine. Fan engines, usually it'll do some damage to the fan. You're not too concerned about the core generally, but the smaller the engine diameters, the smaller the fans, the more worry about the core. So if you do that, it's prudent to just don't put the engine anti-ice on. Go have a look at it. Shut the engine down and go have a look. If there's ice building, then take it off manually, and then start the engine again and put the engine anti-ice on. Do not just turn the engine anti-ice on, because then as soon as that heat hits it, that big chunk of ice is going to come loose and you're going to have issues. So remember that, please. Okay, what else? Is there anything here? So does anybody have any questions with that? Okay, good. Now I want to get here. Okay, this is the engine start in abnormal situations. So I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff here and about memory items and what we need to think about when we get going here. So you'll see the little blurb at the beginning. We always follow procedures to ensure that we have a successful engine start.